Hello and welcome to The Pulse. The highly controversial attempt to amend Hong Kong's extradition legislation continues with concern centred on the rendition of suspects from the SAR to the mainland's judicial system. On Tuesday, Chief Executive Carrie Lam said the government was willing to listen to public concerns about the extradition bill, but she was not interested in accommodating unreasonable wishes. That same afternoon, the Secretary for Justice, Teresa Cheng, and Secretary for Security, John Lee, held a joint press conference at which they made clear the meaning of Mrs. Lam's remarks by rejecting all proposals made by legal scholars and lawmakers. Among these proposals were expanding the jurisdiction of local courts to include crimes committed overseas, and as far as the mainland is concerned, Hong Kong residents would not be rendered across the border for crimes committed on the mainland. Instead, it is suggested that these crimes could be dealt with in local courts, only accepting an extradition request if the requesting jurisdiction has ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or ICCPR. There are also suggestions that the case which the government alleges is its main concern, necessitating urgent action, that of Chan Tong Kai, who is accused of killing his girlfriend in Taiwan, could be dealt with on a one-off basis without wider implications.
實際嘅操作上邊呢，我哋認為除咗港人港審，另外有啲建議修改其他嘅條例呢，呢啲都係不確切可行，所以我哋都係考慮咗之後呢，都認為呢政府現在提出嗰個方案呢，就係比較可取嘅。
Obviously, the key question is what's the hurry? In Hong Kong, currently, there are two particular offences, both criminal. One is fraud, one is sexual abuse of underage children. Those two, currently we have our court actually has that extraterritorial judicial power to put someone on trial locally for offences made in a foreign jurisdiction. So then my proposal is simply to expand the scope of those offences from those two to whatever number.
有啲意見就係話我哋唔好堵塞個漏洞啦。呢個漏洞係22年來我哋都冇堵塞到嘅，我哋鴕鳥咗22年。
As a matter of procedure, the requesting country they have to undertake that the defendant would not face any death penalty when that person is sent, returned to the requesting country after trial and after conviction. And this is governed by our long-term mutual agreements. Problem here is when it comes to case-by-case mechanism, we do not sign any long-term agreement with any other requesting country. That is to say, if that requesting country, whatever that is, violates the undertaking and breach whatever promises they made, there's no way we can say get the person back.
On Tuesday, the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission commented on Hong Kong's extradition bill amendment. It is unprecedented for the committee to express concerns on a single issue rather than have comments reflected in their annual report. The committee said the proposed bill will increase the territory's susceptibility to Beijing's political coercion and further erode Hong Kong's autonomy. The report continued that this bill could create serious risk for US national security and economic interests in Hong Kong.
你可以唔理國際社會，係咪連你嘅傳統盟友你都可以唔理？商界你可以唔理，13萬人你可以唔理，民主派你可以唔理，但係點解連陳雲毅教授你又唔理？係咪而家全世界都誤會你林鄭月娥？
唔使咁衝動，我慢慢會答你。當年喺條例裏邊話不適用於中國其他地方，並不是刻意，亦都更加唔係有啲人話。係怕回歸之後內地嘅法制，更加唔係有啲人話連中方都同意喎，喺中英聯絡小組咧都係中方自己都係驚 如果包埋即係內地咧，會影響到香港嘅順利移交，全部都係廢話。大家可以睇返立法會嘅檔案，係咪啊？
Given the importance of the amendment to the extradition law, we're devoting the whole of this week's programme to discussing the amendment and the wider issues it raises, including how it may affect Hong Kong's media. With me are Christopher Gane, Dean of the Faculty of Law of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and Cedric Alviani, East Asia Bureau Director of Reporters Without Borders. Christopher Gane, can I turn to you first? Is there, in fact, a big problem in Hong Kong with extradition and rendition? The government says legislation needs to be passed very quickly because there's some sort of crisis.
No, I think is the simple answer to that. Hong Kong has had effective extradition arrangements with many, many countries for a long time. The big problem has always been how to handle this kind of thing with the rest of China. The Taiwanese case that has emerged, I think, provides some kind of peg on which the government can hang its arguments, but it's not a particularly convincing one. And at the core of all of this is the absence, or at least the fundamental lack of confidence in what happens in the Chinese judicial system. Extradition is based on mutual respect, on comity, and confidence between the jurisdictions concerned. And that is what is lacking in Hong Kong as far as China is concerned, the rest of China is concerned. And there is nothing in the legislative proposals that are currently being discussed that will do anything to improve that question of confidence.
Well, let me put to you what the advocates of this amendment to the law say. They say, oh, actually, this is not right. There are safeguards within the law that exists, within the act that's going to be amended, and those safeguards include reference to the Hong Kong courts, the rights of people not to be extradited for crimes which do not exist in the SAR itself. I mean, is none of that persuasive to you?
Well, those are pretty minimal protections when you actually look at the way in which the structures are arranged in Hong Kong. The role of the judiciary in extradition arrangements in Hong Kong is relatively minimal. It's a very old-fashioned system. What has happened in other parts of the world where the courts have been given a much more central role in regulating extradition hasn't happened here. It's pretty common in other jurisdictions for the courts to have the authority to say, no, we will not allow this to go ahead because what is likely to happen to this person in the requesting state is not compatible with our human rights standards, our standards of fair trial, our standards about prison conditions, things of that kind. There is none of that in Hong Kong's extradition arrangements, and there is none of that in the arrangements that are currently being proposed by the government in Hong Kong.
Well, Cedric, can I ask you, I mean, there are specific issues relating to extradition which are of quite considerable concern to the media community. How many journalists, for example, are there in jail on the mainland at the moment?
Currently, Reporters Without Borders counts 65 journalists or bloggers detained in China, some of them in conditions that are actually life-threatening. We don't even count the situation in Xinjiang because it's impossible to have a clear account of how many reporters would be jailed there. So of course we are very much concerned. In the past there have already been breaches to the rule of law that have shown that possibly that regulation would allow the Chinese authorities to handpick that or that journalist or that blogger on false grounds, and this happened before.
Because it's interesting that the government has listened to some extent to the business community and very quickly made amendments to this, proposed amendments, excluding certain commercial crimes.
That's a very odd idea. It's not at all clear what the rationale behind that is, other than to meet the concerns of a certain sector in Hong Kong. Actually, it doesn't even achieve what the government thinks it might achieve, because there are quite a lot of the accepted offences are covered by other offences that will still remain within the Fugitive Offenders Ordinance. So it seems odd to single out a particular economic group and give them allegedly special protection, and at the same time actually not deliver the protection which you're claiming to give. So it's a very strange idea indeed, and quite without principle, in fact.
Would you be happier about all of this if there was some exemption for the conduct of journalistic activity?
We would be worried the same way, because actually the question is not how many protections you have within the Hong Kong regulation, and we of course would trust the Hong Kong judges or the Hong Kong authorities to do their best. The problem is that there are more and more exceptions requested by the Chinese authorities, and Hong Kong is not an independent nation. It is somehow under the Chinese jurisdiction, and the interpretation of the basic law has been questioned in the past already. So to us, whatever protection is within the Hong Kong regulation does not equal to a protection that would actually apply whenever the Chinese authorities wanted so.
We're going to take a break now. We'll be back in a few moments. Welcome back. Well, we're continuing our discussion with Christopher Gane and Cedric Alviani on the new extradition laws and indeed some other matters. But before we get on to other matters, can I just ask you, I mean, Hong Kong is very actively discussing this matter of extradition at the moment, but is this an issue that's caused problems between countries or even within countries themselves in other jurisdictions?
Yes, I mean, it's not common that it creates big political questions, but there have been some fairly striking examples of extradition issues giving rise to quite serious diplomatic problems. A number of years ago, one of the early cases in this area is a case involving a young man called Cedric, who was living in the United States. He was charged with 2 counts of murder. He had managed to flee from the United States to the United Kingdom, and the United States wanted to extradite him on these 2 capital murder charges. The offender, or the alleged offender, invoked certain elements of the European Convention on Human Rights, which he said would make it unlawful for the United Kingdom to send him back to the United States. Now, the problem here, of course, is that the United States is not a party to the European Convention on Human Rights and could never be a party. And yet here was the offender invoking a treaty which was completely separate from the extradition treaty to block his extradition. And did so successfully in the end, because the European Court of Human Rights held that sending him back to the United States to face capital charges with a prolonged period on death row in Virginia would be incompatible with his rights under Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights. And that was very difficult for the United States, and actually very difficult for the United Kingdom.
And that's interesting, because it's 2 countries that have a very close relationship.
Yeah. But countries which don't necessarily now share the same values on things like the use of the death penalty and so on. And that has made, that kind of thing has made things a little difficult from time to time between countries which have otherwise got perfectly reasonable diplomatic relations. And it didn't create a diplomatic incident, but it certainly created a great deal of diplomatic embarrassment on both sides.
Just want to slightly move the discussion on, because your organisation, RSF, a couple of weeks ago released its latest report on press freedom, and indeed chose Hong Kong as the place to do so. Well, why did you do that?
Well, we chose Hong Kong as a symbol for our regional press conference for the release of the 2019 RSF World Press Freedom Index. Maybe I should describe a little bit what is this World Press Freedom Index. It is actually a ranking of countries and territories all around the world We evaluate 180 countries and territories according to the level of freedom of the press, the level of freedom of information. And actually, this is quite chilling to see that in the past 6 years, the whole world ranking has lost 13%, meaning that the world is 13% less free than it was 6 years ago.
And Hong Kong, notably, has slid down the rankings.
Yes, when we started the index in 2002, Hong Kong was 18th in the ranking. Now Hong Kong is number 73. Of course, it's not the worst. It's not 180. China, for example, is 177th, which is one of the worst. In Hong Kong, it's still possible to do journalism, but we have a growing concern on how journalists could work independently in Hong Kong.
But I just wondered whether there were specific reasons for the Hong Kong decline in ranking.
Well, that decline comes mostly from these breaches on the rule of law we were talking earlier. Of course, during the time of the umbrella movement, there has been a wave of violence against journalists that has stopped, fortunately. But there is still a growing concern. I also have to precise that the World Press Freedom Index is not the evaluation of the violence against journalists only. We have different criteria, regulation, self-censorship. We have the criteria on how the authorities actually apply the regulation. We have, of course, the violence criteria, but all this is mixed together. So this is an indication that is more about the actual ease for journalists to be able to release.
Because in a separate survey conducted by the Hong Kong Journalists Association, I think the issue that emerged as most worrying was self-censorship.
Yes, absolutely. There's also a growing interference of the Chinese authorities in the media. There's also a growing number of media that are being purchased directly or indirectly or that are being controlled by Chinese companies that might be subject to pressure from the Chinese authorities. So we're talking more about a climate and a concern.
I just want to come back to you for a moment, Christopher Gane, because the issue of this new extradition law seems to form part of a wider picture. Mm. Do you think it forms part of a wider picture which essentially is saying that Hong Kong is moving towards the long-awaited enactment of Article 23, the anti-subversion legislation, and this would form a part of that?
Well, one would wait to see what on earth the Article 23 legislation would look like. But in fact, Article 23, coupled with the issues that are arising in the present extradition amendment arrangements, that would be very worrying indeed, because Hong Kong doesn't have too much in the way of an effective way of controlling subversion. Yeah, it's got this ancient legislation from the colonial period, but the combination of the extradition possibilities or rendition to China, plus a powerful Article 23 legislation would be very troubling indeed.
And of course it would create an offence that was extraditable.
That is the point.
Of subversion.
Right. Because one would expect that issue would be looked at very carefully by the government, because there's no point in introducing legislation which doesn't leave open that possibility. Yeah. And that would be very troubling indeed, because journalists are fairly easily targetable when it comes to, if you want to put an extreme interpretation of what a journalist has said, sedition or its equivalent is something which can quite easily be generated into a criminal offence. So the combination of new extradition arrangements and Article 23 could be quite troubling.
I'm just wondering, with this, the proposed the amendment to the extradition laws, with other curbs that seem to be being imposed on the media, I mean, do you think Hong Kong is going to cease to be the kind of regional or indeed international media centre that it has been for a very long time?
It's not going to happen overnight. because Hong Kong is still very competitive for many reasons. But of course, this is something that might happen in the coming decade because, well, you take the example of our organization. Although we're not exactly journalists, but we're defending journalism. We considered for a long time to open our regional bureau in Hong Kong. What would happen if we had done so? I would be worried that my visa could be denied anytime if I say something that not only the Hong Kong authorities dislike, but the Chinese authorities dislike. That happened in the case of the Financial Times and the CUHK. Whenever there was that extradition law, I could be even more worried that as the chief of bureau, I could be accused of whatever crime. Maybe 10 years ago, I had a traffic accident I wasn't aware of, but the Chinese authorities would provide the proof, and the Hong Kong judges would have to hand me to the Chinese authorities. So this would be a permanent concern for our organization.
And in fact, you're based in Taiwan.
Yeah, so we decided to be based in Taipei, and it is true that we do not have to worry on the application of the rule of law.
Well, that's an interesting point to end with. Thank you both very much indeed. That's it for us for this week. We'll be back next week, same time. See you then.